Good evening. So the rain has started back. I don't know if you all had it where you are, but we had a good downpour for a while this evening. And it's very refreshing after a few days of sun, and may the sun return. Tonight, I'd like to talk a bit about one of the basics. It's always helpful periodically to come back to the very basic teachings, the first teachings of the Buddha. Those of us who've practiced for a long time, there's always more to reflect on, more guidance available by coming back again and working with these teachings. And then for those who are newer to practice, they can be really helpful as guides if you're not familiar with them. So tonight, we're going to talk about the Four Noble Truths. The Tuesday Dharma discussions are working with them currently. They're called the Four Noble Truths. Noble. This is the Bodhisattva way is the noble way. And the word noble, meaning particularly lofty or true or inherently worthy. And these noble truths lay claim to and open up an enormous embrace for us as we work with them, a way to embrace the entirety of our experience and point us to specifics. They look into all the ways that we hold our point of view of who we are and what this life is about. The Four Noble Truths lays out the path to liberation that was taught by the Buddha, the path that guides us to the sources of dukkha. Excuse me. Dukkha, if you're not familiar with that word, is the Sanskrit term for suffering. The suffering that comes to us when we get thoroughly caught up in all of our recycled opinions, our slogans, our broad generalizations, and rigid habit patterns that rule us, the social norms, and the ways that we just habitually and reactively conduct our lives. And the Four Noble Truths help us learn how to pay attention ever more deeply to our experience. This is the practice that we're all engaged in, guided by these teachings. And one of the things that marks Buddhism is that it's not we don't have to believe anything. We're not asked to believe these truths, but rather to investigate them, to investigate along these lines for ourselves. The Four Noble Truths light up the entrances to how we are guided in our intentions. And they help us now, just as they've served over the millennia to free millions of others from very fixed views. The fixed views that we can spend our whole life trying to defend and justify and reckon with. So the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. And the suffering, all the problems that we have and the dissatisfactions. And it can be, in itself, it's a really, it's kind of it's a method, I suppose, that we can practice every day throughout the day when we come up with something that is difficult for us, that we don't like. We can be aware, oh, this is the first noble truth, the truth of difficulties. So you ask yourself, is this true? Is this first noble truth true? When I first heard it, I heard that the first noble truth was everything is suffering, which is it's a problematic way of stating it. It's just pointing out the element, the underlying dis-ease that we can have much of the time without recognizing it. So you want to see if this is true for yourself as you work with this truth. Is it true? Do you recognize how it's true in your own experience? And it's kind of interesting to make a list on a day of all of the different flavors of dissatisfaction and suffering that arise during a day, including impatience, frustration, disappointment, anxiety, confusion. Our sufferings take so many different forms. When our expectations are dashed, our tasks are thwarted, or we get gripped by our inner self-critical voices, the feeling that something's missing, and on it goes. And even when things are great, we can find ourselves jumping ahead, wondering when they're going to go wrong. If everything's great now, how long can this possibly last? Or we might be agitated by the wish to just hang on to a good feeling, worrying about when it's going to be supplanted by our more usual miseries. So it's not necessarily profound suffering. It's not necessarily anguish that we're talking about. It's just all of it, all of the things that are unsatisfying, all of the experiences of unsatisfactoriness. Then the second noble truth is, it tells us to look into the source of this almost inevitable sense of difficulty. This offers us a strong lead. It says, look into the source, into what you're holding on to, into what you're very attached to. And this doesn't mean just attachment to loved ones. And there's a lot of suffering that comes with love, which is not to say that there's anything wrong with it, or it's not a reason to not be deeply connected, but to be able to watch this as, oh yeah, from this kind of attachment, it matters. It matters in a way that I'm invested in this being a certain way. So you look into whatever it is that you cling to. Opinions is another one. We cling to it in order to maintain the sense of safety, or to protect ourselves, our familiar self, our familiar world, to defend it. We're clinging to a sense of control, to our preferences or our assumptions. So noticing also, as practitioners, we tune into what are the assumptions here underlying a moment of dissatisfaction. Because, of course, our preferences, our opinions don't control the world. Our own will or desires doesn't control the world. We control how we work with it, how we work with our inner states. So we notice what is familiar and habituated, what's comfortable in its own way, and we don't want to be uncomfortable. And because of that, we even hold on to habitual forms of suffering and distress. We can be very invested in things that make us miserable. And all of this is part of what we identify as ourself. the self inside, the inner experience of self, and the self that lies outside, which we figure as other or the world. And this second truth is also pointing to ways that we formulate the self, which is a fiction that's continually undermined despite all of our efforts to reinforce its reality. As the world is always challenging our sense of self. So we can see that easily in the practice of health or sickness or aging. There's so many ways in which this fiction of the self is challenged. And actually, apropos of that, it's we could be doing this practice that is following the way of the Four Noble Truths, and then when we hit a time when we become very disillusioned, not only about the path, because the path is not it's not easy, and it's not leading us to some glorious way of being different. So we can get very disillusioned with the self, with our imaginings about our life and who we are. And that's very sobering. And yet that's what we're all about, is seeing through our illusions and delusions. Then the third noble truth is that there is a way to move past this habitual form of suffering, the forms of suffering. And there is a way. This third noble truth is also calls us to say, well, what is it that I think liberation is? And we face our delusion about liberation. As we move past what we take for granted, what we take at face value, what we identify as our life without, before we begin to look more deeply into it. And as we do, and we experience that the mystery of the effects of practice, periodically there'll be an opening that relieves us of anxiety. We suddenly see things with a fresh glance. And we begin to get an inkling about what this liberation is, what we mean by liberation. How this sense of myself is configured. And we investigate it. We continue to, we're always investigating. The teachings don't tell us that investigating the conditions of our life will end the conditions, but that seeing into them deeply changes our view of the conditions that we encounter. And when our view changes, our choices open up, and we see more spaciously into conditions, how we experience them, and it changes how we function. Seeing into the heart of the matter of life and death changes everything. And it relieves the kind of suffering that comes with clinging to a static, habitual, mind-generated description of experience that excludes so much, and that comes from not really actually looking directly, but only experiencing through a sieve of language. So in this, there is a way, this third noble truth, we're learning how to hear the beating heart in all of our experience. and we stop ignoring and abandoning our own direct experience and all the many subtle features of it. And then the fourth noble truth lays out a set of entrances into liberation, the Noble Eightfold Path. And the many doors of a life. We could also call these the 8 instructions, or the 8 spokes of the wheel of the Dharma, all of which bring us to liberation from fixed views as we learn how to embody awareness and presence, to really be present to everything. The whole catastrophe it's become a favorite way of describing life, the whole catastrophe. So these 8 instructions, or the Eightfold Path, are usually said to be divided into 3 different groups. So the first is the wisdom group, which includes right view and right intention. Right view. So we're really looking today at right view, and I think that's going to continue to be explored interactively on Tuesday night. So right view is what is your point of view? What makes up your point of view? What is fixed in it, and what is influenceable? What is the view that that liberates us from suffering? And then right thought, which is recognizing that every thought is a seed. Every word we use and description we make is a seed, and that conditions what comes after, that conditions our experience and our ways of behaving in the world. That's the wisdom group. Then there's the moral discipline group of the Eightfold Path, which is right speech, how we use our speech to bring goodness or harm, to promote self well-being, or to make more trouble. Then there's right action, which is really about integrity, so that our intentions and our actions come into alignment. And so one of the things that we're doing in meditation is we're getting way more sensitized to what our intentions are. Intention, the deepest sense of intention, is the vow, bodhisattva vow. And then there's right livelihood, what we spend our work life engaged in, whether it is brings goodness and health to all living things, or whether it brings harm. And doing anything that we do with the awareness that this is action that we're taking, and to do it in such a way that it brings the intent. We're clear in our intention to do it in a way that brings benefit. So that's the moral discipline group. And then there's the concentration group, which is right effort, how we use our energy, whether we use it well in an appropriate measure, not too much, not too little. There's right mindfulness, which is maintaining awareness of our thoughts, words, and deeds. And the deepest sense of right mindfulness is remembering the vow to awaken for all beings. Right mindfulness, every moment is lived in the vow. And then right concentration, which is being able to be wholehearted and present in whatever is going on. So right concentration in meditation, and concentrated in whatever we're doing wholeheartedly, body and mind, in alignment, dedicated to the task at hand. So the Noble Eightfold Path is a really sturdy structure for guiding us along a path of practice that will bring peace and happiness into the world through the vehicle of our own life. Yeah, our own life, which is lived in an ordinary way every day. Bhikkhu Bodhi says of this, to follow the Noble Eightfold Path is a matter of practice rather than intellectual knowledge. But to apply the path correctly, it has to be properly understood. In fact, right understanding of the path is itself a part of the practice. It's a facet of right view, the first path factor, the forerunner and guide for the rest of the path. So right view. It can be really helpful too, when something's going on and it just doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel honest. It doesn't feel kind, whatever it is. What you're tuning into at that point when you're trying to figure out what's the problem here. What you're working with is the practice of right view, of examining what is for its source, its seeds of harm or benefit. So even if we're tempted, as we often are in Zen, to label intellectual comprehension as bothersome, it is in fact quite essential to ultimate success in the practice. But it comes along naturally. It doesn't matter initially what we think. Just so long as we do the practice, we begin, it shows us the way. But because it's really helpful to think about the path, the Eightfold Path, we divide them into separate aspects so that we can understand them even more minutely. But of course, our life is not separated, not the direct life, but our view and our intellectual machinations are all about separating, parsing. So the lived Noble Eightfold Path begins with seeing into the true nature of our subjective experience, right view or right understanding. We call these this word right. When we say right view, it's not as opposed to wrong. But maybe we could say, instead of right, we could say complete, wide and open, seeing deeply into the entirety, including being aware of our own distractions and the quality of our own mind at the moment. Right view clears one's path of confusion and misunderstanding and deluded thinking. Right view is operating when maybe you've had this experience of you're talking with somebody and you're kind of you're both missing it and you can't figure out what's going on, and you realize, or you're having an argument, you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is not an argument about opposition. This is misunderstanding that's going on. I'm using this word in one way, you're using it in another way. That's a moment of recognizing, oh wait, what's at stake here is we aren't looking closely enough at what our views are, what our view is of this, what our understanding of this word is. And very often when you can work from the standpoint of it's a misunderstanding, then you can begin to parse it out and trace it back to where you started talking about two different things. You know what I mean? Have you had that experience? You're arguing with somebody and you realize, oh gosh, this is not what it seemed. Yeah. So what are the ingredients of the right view? Well, first of all, of course, as I've said, it's not fixated in the usual way, because part of the basic teaching is the teaching of impermanence. Impermanence everywhere. Every conditioned thing is impermanent. So our views also are of the same nature. We struggle when we try to keep all conditioned things from changing, and we can struggle when we try to keep our views closed in and tidy and not moved by new information or different perspectives. Which is why it's so important to listen when talking with when working with various views, is to listen very deeply into what the felt experience is that's going into the words that somebody else is saying. So we also investigate the the truth of the interpenetration of all conditions at all times. There's room for everything that arises. Nothing gets in the way of anything else. This is important. This is what's meant by the identity of relative and absolute. This is really a very central teaching and view in the practice of right view. Conditioned things arise together, and each of us can realize this in our own lives. Each conditioned thing is temporary, and it's connected to everything else, and it's also subject to the truth of impermanence. I was thinking of this today, walking in the woods, and if you've been out in the woods much or anywhere, you notice how all the rain and all the fallen leaves and all the twigs and mosses are crushing down into the slop that will become the soil of the springtime. Yeah, it's so clear that everything continues to change, and it does it all together. Another factor in this right view is cause and effect. The immutable characteristic of all action in body, speech, and mind. We can always notice if we're looking, if we're paying attention to the consequence of any thought that comes up, any words spoken or actions taken. You can see it clearly for yourself. So as we become more aware, more attuned, and more aligned, this is the ground for becoming more sensitive to the workings of karma. All the conditions that our life unfolds within and was produced by, actually, as well as all collective karma. And seeing this, how does seeing into this free us? What is meant by it? This is the practice. This is what we do in practice. We look into it. We investigate the meaning of this. So liberation according to the Buddha, doesn't change the interdependent and impermanent nature of the conditions of our life. Impermanence, interdependence, and no self. But liberation lies in how this practice changes our view of experience. So right view includes appreciating the workings of karma, of impermanence. Right view is really getting a bead on the Four Noble Truths for ourselves. So these are the Noble Eightfold Path, which I really encourage everybody to participate together, to investigate together on Tuesday nights, how this works in your own life. Not just on Tuesday nights, all the time. Yeah. So there may have been something in this that sparks a reflection that you haven't had before. May that be so. May it be useful. This is my fondest wish. Thank you.